You so much for traveling to our little city here, Emeryville, California, the little city that could. Thank you, Professor Blakely, for bringing this delegation. We're really quite honored to be, let's say, the smallest city on your trip. But we have a lot to show in our 1 square mile. This year, Emeryville celebrates its 120th anniversary as an incorporated city. So I haven't been here that whole time, but you know, we do have a compact history that we're going to share with you today. Over that time, we started out as a sleepy cattle town and evolved into a gritty industrial city, and then into a high-density, mixed-use urban center that you see today, and hopefully you're enjoying. Emeryville is home to many large corporations, including Pixar Animation Studios, Novartis and Grifols pharmaceutical companies, and many others, including the biotechnology companies that you're going to be visiting today. Emeryville is also home to around 12,000 residents, and because of our strong business community and other attractions, our daytime population is closer to 35,000. All of that, like I said, is in the compact space of just about a square mile, which to you folks is 3 square kilometers. In addition to our biotech companies and other commercial enterprises, Emeryville is proud of its record in providing affordable housing and amenities for our residents and visitors, including parks, recreation programs, bike paths, and other alternative transportation facilities, as well as great shopping, dining, and other entertainment attractions. So I hope you enjoy your brief and dynamic visit to our dynamic little city, and I hope it proves useful in your efforts to foster innovative development in Australia. And I have a couple little stories to share with you. There's some sculptures right here in the back of the room. This is a piece. It's a 2-part piece called The Conversation. And these were actually done by my co-counsel, Scott Donahue. This was long before he was on council in the early 1980s. And The Conversation is the polite way to phrase the name of this piece. And as we're streaming live, we're going to keep our language clean, but you can see that the sculptures are saying something to each other, and I would begin with this fellow and end with this fellow. And it is an extreme form of political conversation that they're using. And I am very happy to say that in these chambers, we're very cordial. My colleagues and I like each other very much. We get along very well, and I've never seen these words uttered in this room. And gosh, I feel like there was one more little story I wanted to share, but I think it's time for me to move on so you guys have a very packed day. I just want to thank you again for coming. I'm going to be joining along if there's room on the bus for the tour. So I look forward to getting to know you all. And again, thank you for visiting our little city that could.
For those of you I haven't already met, I'm Charlie Bryant. I'm the Community Development Director here in Emeryville. I have a brief presentation for you on the history of Emeryville, and then we'll turn it over to the people who really know the history, which is our former City Manager and Economic Development and Housing Director, Pat O'Keefe, who has just arrived, and Rich Robbins, the CEO of Wareham Development. This is kind of the same view that we had on our screensaver there. This is looking from the hills down towards Emeryville. We are right here along the bay shore. These high rises and these buildings along here and this peninsula out here. I'm sure you probably recognize this across the bay. That's San Francisco, where you are staying. To the right here that you can't quite see is the Golden Gate Bridge. Where we are right now is just off the left side of this picture, and this kind of horizontal looking building right here is Emery Station East, which is one of the buildings that you'll be visiting today. I'd like you to just remember this picture because I'll show you another picture that is similar but 140 years earlier. So Emeryville, as the mayor said, is 1 square mile or 3 square kilometers. It sits here between Berkeley, Oakland, and San Francisco. Like most of the United States and California and Australia as well. It was originally inhabited by indigenous people. In our case, it was the Ohlone Indians, who were here for a couple of thousand years before the Europeans arrived. Then in the 17 and 1800s, California, as you probably know, was part of Spain. And then when Mexico became an independent country in 1820, I believe it was, then we were part of Mexico. And during that era, this area was a Mexican land grant. It was a cattle ranch owned by a family called the Peraltas. And this is probably a somewhat romantic image of what life was like on the Peralta Rancho. I'm sure you've heard of our gold rush in 1849, and shortly after that, in 1850, California became a state of the United States, which led to a huge influx of Americans mostly from the East, and people from all over the world, really. One of them was this gentleman here, whose name was Joseph Emery. Joseph Emery purchased some land from the Peraltas, the area that we're in the middle of right now. He laid out some streets and building lots and started developing a little town. It wasn't until he did that, he bought the land in about 1858. And then a little less than 40 years later, in 1896, he and his business associates got Emeryville incorporated as a separate city, at that time with a population of about 500 people, I think, something like that. This is a map of Emeryville about 18 years before it was incorporated. This is from 1878. This shows Joseph Emery's original tract down here. There was a big horse racing track in the middle of town, which is gone now, long gone. Along the bay shore, there was a steel mill, which was there for over 100 years before the land was bought by IKEA, who built the first IKEA store in Northern California on it. And there was a paint plant up here. There was an old Indian shell mound right here by the shoreline, which was developed by an entrepreneur as an amusement park. They had dancing and amusement rides and all kinds of things at what was called Shell Mound Park. At the north end of town, there was a kind of a remnants of the old Peralta Rancho, which was called Butchertown. This was an area of stockyards and slaughterhouses and meat packing plants. There weren't very many houses in town. There weren't very many people living here, but there were a few, and there were a few mansions, including Joseph Emery's mansion, which is where there, I don't know if you have IHOP in Australia, International House of Pancakes. That's what's there now. But back in 1878, this was Joseph Emery's mansion, which looked like this. This is the image that I referred to before when I asked you to remember the photograph from the hills. Because in addition to his beautiful, ornate Victorian mansion and all the happy couples strolling along San Pablo Avenue, you can also see San Francisco here in the background, and the Golden Gate. Of course, that connects the bay to the ocean. That's before the Golden Gate Bridge was built, but it was called the Golden Gate before that. And here's the horse racing track back here. And here, very importantly, along the shoreline, you can see this little choo-choo train. That railroad was built right about the time this picture was made, around the late 1870s. And that railroad has been there ever since. It's now a very busy mainline railroad track, about 140 years it's been there. And that's one of the big reasons that Emeryville developed the way it did, and also because of our location right here on the bay. So, in the 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century, Emeryville developed as a major industrial hub. There were all kinds of factories. A lot of major American companies were either headquartered here or had their factories and plants and distribution centers here. These are just a few images of what Emeryville looked like in the first half of the 20th century. A big steel mill. I'm not sure exactly what this is, some kind of a plating plant. This is an image from the 1940s looking north. The Bay Bridge would be over here to the left. There, you came across there this morning. This is the rail line. And this freeway was built when the Bay Bridge was built. The original shoreline was right along here next to the railroad track. This is the steel mill. Whoa. That was there for, like I say, over 100 years, and this is the paint plant up here. Shell Mound Park was gone by the time this picture was taken and replaced with industrial uses, and of course the racetrack was also gone and replaced by other industrial uses. You can see, though, the area between the railroad and the highway was all filled in after that highway was built. So this is Bay Fill here in this area, and to the north you can see it was actually still water. In Berkeley they actually have a park called Aquatic Park that is a kind of a lake, but what it is, it's actually the part of the bay that got cut off from the bay when the freeway was built. And you can see there's a pier here that sticks out into the bay. This was where the ships would come for the paint company, but there wasn't anything really into the bay other than this pier in the 1940s. Over time, that pier developed into a peninsula that really started to get filled in the 1960s and early 70s. And this is what that looked like when it was under construction. And this is what it looks like today. That peninsula juts out about a mile into the bay, and it's got a couple of marinas out here at the end. Our biggest park, Marina Park, out here, from which there are beautiful views of San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. There's an apartment complex here, which is now condominiums, 1,250 units. It's called Watergate. And then there are 4 high-rise office towers and a high-rise hotel tower here. There are also several restaurants. Our police headquarters is right there, and there's a fire station right there. When this peninsula was built, there was a real change, a real sea change in Emeryville, both physically and politically. Within about 5 years of the time that the Watergate apartments were built, 4 out of 5 city council members lived at Watergate. And that's not because the existing council members moved out to Watergate. These were the new residents who got themselves elected to the city council. And there was a real kind of a shift, as I said, in politics and development at that time. It happened to coincide with an era when these big old companies were becoming less viable. Some of them were going out of business, or they were just moving to other places where land was cheaper and they were able to operate more efficiently and less expensively. And so the new city council was trying to figure out what to do to try to revitalize the city with all these large corporations that had kind of been the driving force of Emeryville for almost 100 years. Now what do we do? Well, California had, up until 4 years ago, a very incredible tool called Redevelopment, with a capital R. Are you all familiar with tax increment financing? You know how that works? Okay, so I'll briefly go over that. But the way redevelopment worked before it was abolished was, first you create a redevelopment agency. And in the case of Emeryville, the city council appointed themselves as the redevelopment agency, but it was a separate legal entity, and the city staff served as the redevelopment agency staff. And Pat can talk a lot more about that. He's very familiar with the whole redevelopment process. Then you have to establish a redevelopment area, a physical area, with a finding of blight, that the area is blighted and it needs to be rehabilitated. Then you prepare a plan for your redevelopment area, showing what you're going to do to fix all of this. Then you freeze the property tax. I assume you have property tax in Australia? Yes. So you freeze the property tax level at what it was when the redevelopment area was established. And then the additional tax that results from development, which is the so-called tax increment, all goes to the redevelopment agency for use in revitalizing the city. 20% of that tax increment had to be set aside for affordable housing. And the other 80% could be used for seed money, for future development projects, for capital improvements, park, street beautification, and things like that. And a small amount could be used to run the redevelopment agency, but otherwise tax increment money was not allowed to be used for city operating purposes. And I would say one reason, not the main reason, but one reason that redevelopment was abolished in California is that there were a number of cities who really didn't abide by this rule. There were cities that paid half their police force from redevelopment tax increment, which really was not allowed, even though they did it anyway. So this is a very simplistic diagram. I'm sure Pat can find the flaws in it, but this just tries to illustrate in a very simple way how this tax increment financing system works. So you freeze the base tax at what it was before the redevelopment area, when the redevelopment area is established, assuming the tax was pretty low because the value of the land was pretty low. These different blue colors represent the so-called taxing entities, and those are the folks who get a slice of the property tax. So, of course, the city got some, and the county got some, the school district got some, and then there are a lot of other special agencies that get a piece of the property tax. There's transit agencies and water and sewer districts, and probably a couple dozen different special districts that get a little piece of everybody's property tax. Then when redevelopment is established and the value of the land increases, all of this is the tax increment, and that all goes to the redevelopment agency. The base tax still gets distributed among the various taxing entities, so they don't lose anything that they didn't already have, but they don't get the benefit of this big boost in property values. This is the 20% money that's set aside for affordable housing, and the rest of it is the 80% money that could be used for all those other things that I mentioned. Now, what happened when redevelopment went away 4 years ago, the value of the land is still the same, the property tax is still the same, but the tax increment doesn't go to the redevelopment agency anymore. One reason this is not entirely accurate is the redevelopment agency, even though it's gone, still has a lot of bonded indebtedness that needs to be paid off, and that still comes out of the old tax increment. So that should be shown here if we're going to be entirely accurate. But assuming the bonded indebtedness is taken care of, then all the taxing entities get their share of the property tax proportional to the new value, which, as you can see, is a lot more than it was before redevelopment was established. The city gets, this chunk here, and so the city actually gets a bit of a windfall. We couldn't use the redevelopment agency tax increment funding for operating, but we can use this money for operating. This money goes back into our general fund. We can use it for whatever we want. We refer to this as the boomerang funds, which I'm sure will be, a familiar concept to you all. It means, obviously it came back to us. So we get a certain chunk of money from the demise of redevelopment that we can use for other things, and the City Council has established a policy of setting aside 20% of the boomerang funds for affordable housing, 5% for other economic development purposes, and 75% for our capital improvement program. Of course, that's up to the City Council to decide. That's what our City Council decided, but other cities can do whatever they want with their boomerang money. This is a map that shows Emeryville's redevelopment areas, and as you can see, it's almost the entire city. The only thing that wasn't included was the Watergate Apartments and the Marina Park. The first one was established in 1976, and frankly, I cannot tell you why it's so gerrymandered, but that's what it looked like. And then a few years later, I believe in the early 80s, the rest of the city, other than these areas out here, got filled in. So we had two different redevelopment areas, but they were kind of intertwined. And the city got, or the agency, I should say, got the tax increment from all of this. So during the era of redevelopment, here are a few examples of some of our old industrial properties that got redeveloped. This is an old railroad yard that was at the south end of town, and that became a shopping center with a number of big box stores, Home Depot, and Target, Toys R Us, things like that. It also has a housing component to it. I don't recall the exact number of units, but there's several hundred units in these Bridgecourt apartments, they're called. They're actually right across the street over here behind City Hall. This is an old paint pigment plant that got, and because of our industrial legacy, almost every property in Emeryville is contaminated. The soil and the water is contaminated. It costs millions of dollars to clean that up to a level where, it's inhabitable. So that's what a lot of the redevelopment agency money went to, was cleaning up these sites and then assembling the property. And this then became the Bay Street Mixed-Use Center, which includes about 400,000 square feet of retail, a 16-screen cinema, and almost 400 housing units. This was the old Del Monte cannery plant right across the street over here, and that became Pixar Animation Studios. You're all familiar with Pixar? How many have seen Finding Nemo? Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, you know where that takes place, right? Do you remember the seagulls that say, mine, mine, mine? Well, if you look across the street on your way back out to the bus, at the top of the Pixar building across the street, you'll see one of those seagulls, a native of Sydney, who's sitting over there on that building. An old steel mill. This was actually one of the pictures that I showed previously of the old industry in Emeryville. This was torn down, replaced by about 350 apartment units. This picture was taken, I think, just shortly after this project was built, because those telephone poles are no longer there. Part of the project was to underground all of the utility lines, so it looks a little nicer than this without the wires. This was an old corn syrup processing plant called Liquid Sugar, and it was torn down and replaced by a townhouse development also called Liquid Sugar, which has nothing to do with the townhouses except that it's on the old Liquid Sugar site. We didn't just tear down buildings and build new ones. We also kept a number of nice old buildings and turned them into new uses. So this was the Grove Valve and Regulator factory next to the railroad, and it got renovated as an office development. Have you all heard of Cliff Bar? Do you know Cliff Bar? It's a like a energy bar. They make lots of different products, but they're all like energy food for athletes. Anyway, they're a nationwide company in the U.S., and their headquarters is here in this building. Then down the street here we had Emeryville Warehouse Lofts, Emeryville Warehouse, which was, as the name implies, a warehouse. And it was renovated and turned into loft apartments and offices. It was a very nice job. So, about 7 years ago, we updated our general plan, which is every city in California is required to have what's called a general plan, which is the master plan.
LEP.
Excuse me?
An LEP.
LEP, what does that stand for?
Environmental plan.
Okay.
Same thing.
All right, so think of LEP. That's what we call that the general plan. This is image from the general plan. It's a computer-generated kind of a block model of what could develop in the future in Emeryville under the policies and goals that are in the general plan, which are then carried forward through our zoning regulations. All of the blue buildings are new buildings. These are potential development. It's not to say that it's going to look exactly like this, but under the policies we have in place, something similar to this could develop. People say, well, what can you build in 1 square mile that's already been built out and it's 120 years old? Well, as you can see, we've got lots of places where we could develop some new things. A big part of our plan also includes new parks. We have very few parks. Our first park, in fact, was in 1976, 80 years after the city was incorporated. So we're really starving for parks. So we have an ambitious plan to acquire some existing properties and develop some big new parks, but that's a tall order. I hope I live to see it. We also have some images in the general plan that tries to stimulate people's imaginations to get them to visualize what the city could look like in the future under the general plan policies. So here's just a few examples. This is a street, just 53rd Street, just a few blocks to the north of here, which actually has a creek running under it in a pipe. Comes down from the hills, goes into the bay, but you'd never know it. So our general plan envisions this as a greenway with a creek brought up to the surface and a bike boulevard and more landscaping and happy couples walking along and that sort of thing. This is the Home Depot, which is in the shopping center that replaced the old rail yard. And one of the big ideas in our general plan is to transform our shopping centers, of which we have 2 or 3, with big surface parking lots, to transform those into urban neighborhoods. We don't want to displace the existing businesses that are there, so we're not saying they have to leave, but what we'd like to do is fill in these parking lots with parking structures and then mixed-use buildings. So here's the image for that. As you can see, Home Depot is still there. People are loading their lumber here on the sidewalk, and the drive aisle of the parking lot becomes a city street, and there's a little park over here and parking garage here and maybe some residential or some kind of high-density mixed-use development. We actually do have one project that is going to start construction very soon that is taking one of our old shopping center, well, not exactly a shopping center, but a commercial complex with vast surface parking lots and filling in all of the surface parking lots with structure, well, with this kind of stuff. And that's all been approved, and most of the buildings are in right now for building permits. That's not this, it's another one in another part of town. And then this is kind of ground zero in Emeryville for our traffic congestion problem. This is the place that people think about when they think about traffic in Emeryville. And as you can see, it's pretty suburban. This is one of those shopping centers, big surface parking lots, lots of asphalt, lots of cars. So the vision for this area, this is what we call our core area. It's got the highest density development, the highest height limits. And so if those little blue boxes on that computer image were to get built, it would look sort of like this. So you have buildings right up to the street, so you can walk along the sidewalk and do your window shopping. It's much more friendly for pedestrians and bicycles and transit, and we have some high-rise development. It's not Manhattan, but you have 2 or 3 high-rise towers. So this is just a quick shot of Emeryville's population, past and present and future. As I said, back in 1896, when the city was incorporated, we had probably about 500 residents. It then bumped up in the early 20th century to about 2,600. And during that entire industrial era, the population held steady at that level until the 1970s. Then in the 70s was when the peninsula was built and the Watergate apartments were built, and the population then went up. And then in the 80s, I didn't show you a picture of this, but there's a high-rise tower right next to the freeway called Pacific Park Plaza that has about 600 units. So that was another big bump in population, along with some other things that occurred in the 80s. And since then, it's just been on a steady upward course. 10,000, according to the 2010 U.S. Census. I just earlier this week got the latest estimate from the state of our population, which, as Diane said, is about 12,000. It's about 11,721, I think, or something like that, which is about on track with what this says we were supposed to have in 2015. And assuming things continue on the same course, we should be up to about 21,000 people by 2040, which is 24 years from now. Now, I'm just going to briefly, Rich is going to talk more about this, but I just want to show you a few pictures, and you've got probably some of these in the Wareham handout, about the Emery Station development. In 1989, you may have heard we had a big earthquake in California, in Northern California. It's called the Loma Prieta earthquake, and there was a lot of damage around here. And one of the buildings that was damaged was, beyond repair actually, was the Oakland train station. So we have a national rail passenger system called Amtrak. Goes all over the country. There's trains that come here from Chicago and LA and Seattle to San Francisco, but they can't go all the way to San Francisco because there's this big bay in the way, and there's no tunnel or bridge for passenger trains to cross the bay. So what they do is they get off on this side of the bay and they get on an Amtrak bus that then takes them over to San Francisco. Before the earthquake, the Oakland station was where everybody got off the train and onto the bus to go to San Francisco. After the earthquake, there was no place to do that. Oakland, and I used to work for the city of Oakland, so I guess I can say this. In fact, I worked for the city of Oakland at that time. Oakland, in its kind of bureaucratic way, was fumbling around trying to figure out how to build a new train station. It took them several years to do it. Meanwhile, Emeryville, and primarily Rich Robbins, built this station here. They did it in less than a year. And I got to say, I remember working in the city of Oakland and hearing, what? Emeryville built a train station and it's already operating? What the heck? So this then became the San Francisco station. So if you go to Chicago and take the train to here, the big board that's up there that says where all the trains go, it actually says Emeryville. And then I think maybe in parentheses, San Francisco. So we have 36 passenger trains a day, including the ones to LA and Seattle and Chicago. We also have a whole lot of commuter trains that run to our state capital in Sacramento and down to San Jose and other points in California. So this image shows one of the commuter trains in the foreground and one of the long distance trains in the background, and this, of course, is the train station right here. As I said, Wareham built this station. They then leased it to the city, and the city then turned around and leased it to Amtrak. The area in the background is the Emery Station complex, and you can obviously see how it got that name. These are all a bunch of buildings that Wareham built around the train station. This is a picture of 4 of those. There was also, the complex also includes a number of existing buildings that have been renovated, and also a residential building. I'm just showing you the new buildings that are office and laboratory. Emory Station 1, across the street from the station, train station was built in 1998. And I believe Nano Precision Medical that we're going to go to today is in this building. Emory Station North, just to the north of that one, was built in 2000. Emory Station East was built in 2006, and that's where another of the companies is that we're going to be visiting. That's that horizontal-looking building that I pointed out in the first picture, 2006. And then right across the street from that is Emory Station Greenway building that was constructed in 2011. That building is now having a lot of tenant improvements for Stanford University has a health center that's going into that building. And I was going to say on the drawing boards, but actually it's past the drawing boards. This is the so-called Emory Station West at Emeryville Transit Center. This is just north of the train station. The idea for this building has been around for over a decade, probably as long as I've worked here, which is 16 years, if not longer. But it's finally literally getting off the ground. This building is now in for a building permit, and our chief building official informs me that he expects to issue the building permit before the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. So this building will be under construction within the next few months. It contains the reason it's called a transit center is on the ground floor it will have bus bays for all those Amtrak buses that take you to San Francisco. You'll be able to get right off the train, step across the platform, and step onto the bus. Currently you have to kind of take a little walk around the train station to get to the buses. There will also be parking for the Amtrak station in here. The rest of the building is 250,000 square feet, I think, about lab space and lab and office space. This is what it looks like from the other side, from the street side, with a grand staircase, goes up to an upper level plaza, and then connects to a pedestrian bridge that we have that goes across the railroad tracks. So that's a real quick whirlwind tour of the history of development in Emeryville. Back to our original picture here with Emory Station right there. At this point, I'll turn it over to Pat O'Keefe, who can give you the inside story on how this all happened. Before that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have about my presentation. Yes?
Question. In your development plan, I mean, obviously one of the sort of fantastic characteristics of Emeryville is your location on the bay. Have you thought about removing the freeway?
Yeah, thank you, Diane. Yeah, the question is, have we thought about removing the freeway? Well, I guess we could think about it. I think that would be a real uphill battle.
I can answer that.
Okay.
I was the consultant to the state of California.
You want to speak into this mic, Ed? Right here, this one. Right here.
I was the consultant to the state of California after the earthquake on replacing the freeway. The freeway was not badly damaged in this section, but closer to Oakland, it was very badly damaged. And so we moved the freeway, which was against federal law. The federal law says you must replace where the project was. I won't go into all the political shenanigans that went on with that, but not only did we get the money to replace the freeway, we got new money to put it in a different location. And the new location had less impact on low-income people and better routing for the trucks to come in and out to unload cargo. But this part of the freeway was not damaged enough to move it. So that's why it's still there.
Right. And it is Interstate...
Nothing else there except water.
It is Interstate 80, which is the main route between San Francisco and New York. So we kind of have to keep it somewhere. The area that Ed is referring to is to the south. You can't see it here, but it's off to the left of this picture, West Oakland. Yes?
I feel like it's very impressive the amount of focus you have on affordable housing, and the city's maintained that. We're kind of interested in what makes for successful innovation districts. And can you say anything about the role of affordable housing in supporting all the businesses that occur? Is there a link? Is there a relationship between the success of the area and the impact that we're getting with affordable housing, like working housing?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there is definitely a need for affordable housing. I would say that especially in our retail industries and restaurants that are here, you do have lower paid workers who work in those places, and they need less expensive housing. So that can go to helping them to be local. However, I don't know how much you've heard about this, but there's a huge affordable housing crisis in California and the Bay Area in particular right now. We just recently, we still have a requirement for affordable units in all of our new developments. That's a whole other story that I won't go into, but a project just came online that has, I think, 12 affordable units in it, and we got 2,300 applications for those 12 units. So the lucky 12 get picked by lottery. So yeah, it's definitely needed. It definitely has helped, but it's nowhere near enough to meet the demand. So we're trying to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
Hi, John. Thanks. I'm interested in the economic composition. And I know there are businesses like Pixar that have been around a while, and Novartis that's been, and Bayer and there's the relationship there. How much has that been by accident that those companies have wanted to come to Emeryville, and how much has it been through incentives or through drives that councils made to try and bring those to them?
I think I'll defer to Pat to respond to those kind of questions. I'm the planner in the room. He's more the economic guru. Let's take one more and then we'll let Pat speak.
I'm interested, 4 years ago when the redevelopment tax increment distribution stopped, what was the criteria that sort of led to this idea that you reached its served its purpose and didn't need to continue with that funding model anymore?
Oh, well, actually, Pat would be a better one to address that too, but I can just say briefly, the state was having a budget crisis, and it's kind of a domino effect. As you saw, the school district is one of the entities that gets taxes, and when you have redevelopment, they don't get, a chunk of that tax increment. The state has an obligation to fund the school districts to the extent that they are not funded locally, and so by eliminating redevelopment, the state was able to reduce its obligation to schools because they then got this tax. I mean, this is a very oversimplified explanation, but and that then freed up that state money to be able to use for other things and helped the state to balance its budget. So there has been for a long time a real tension in California between the cities and the state government. And there's an organization called the California League of Cities that represents the cities, and it's a real battle between the state level government and the local level government, and it really came to a head with the battle over redevelopment. So at this point I'd like to turn it over to Pat O'Keefe, who served as our city manager from 2006 to 2012 or something like that. Forever, yeah. No, John Flores was forever.
They both kind of blend together.
And before he was our city manager, he was our economic development and housing director, so he knows the inside scoop on all this stuff.
Thanks, Charlie. So good morning, everyone. Charlie did a really good job of summarizing, I think, a lot of the key elements of the history here and the transformation. So what I'm going to do is limit my remarks to kind of underline some of what he said and fill in some gaps in places. And then I'll be happy to take questions and we can focus in on what you're interested in hearing about. So you've often heard that innovation is born from necessity and crisis, and that in fact was what happened here in Emeryville. As Charlie mentioned, we were going through this period of time where we had this substantial loss of industry and property tax base, and we needed to do something in order to correct that and be able to have revenues that would operate the government. So that's led to then a political will and a new general plan that Charlie mentioned, the general plan that was just recently adopted. That replaced a 20-year-old general plan. But at the time, the general plan and the zoning that went into effect, this is the late 80s, early 90s, was really quite a huge change. And what it did is it allowed previously industrial areas to become commercial and residential. And a key aspect of that was much of that zoning allowed mixed use. And so you could mix those uses together, which at the time was very forward thinking. It's less so now. You see more mixed-use zoning in the United States these days, but at the time that was very forward-thinking. The new council members that Charlie mentioned formed this political base and support for new development and economic development based on that general plan. And there were 3 council members who were on the council for approximately 20 years, which is an incredible length of time, I think, in any political environment, certainly in California, where there's a lot of change. And I can't emphasize how important that was to have a political majority on council that had this vision and wanted to see it through, and stuck with being on the council and supporting all of the new development proposals that came forward that would help in that transformation. So when people ask about, well, how did Emeryville do this, I always point to that political consistency as being one of the key elements. Another key element that Charlie touched on is simply location. There are many cities that try and replicate what we've done that are not as well located as we are. So, you know, the real estate term here is location, location, location. It's very true. We're sitting in the center of the Bay Area. We're at a confluence of a number of major freeways. We have easy connections through transit, a very strong bus system that we have in the area. Of course, the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit train system. And as a result, we're very closely located to major business centers. So Oakland is a major business center. San Francisco is a major business center. Those are things that are easily accessible to us. So as a result of that, we have interest in people who want to live here who can easily access those jobs. We have businesses that when they get priced out of San Francisco will come across the bay to Emeryville in order to locate in relatively less expensive space. So I can't overemphasize how important that proximity is, and the fact that we're part of this 2 million person metropolitan area is part of what makes us successful. Another locational advantage for the tech and the biotech industries that we've been able to support, and Rich will go into this in more detail, is our proximity, of course, to the University of California, Berkeley. And then not too far away, across the bay, are Stanford and UCSF, which are also major educational institutions. So when you talk about innovation, you need to talk about innovation that's happening within the university system that then spills out to surrounding areas. And Rich will do a much better job of describing how we've been able to capture that than I can, so I'll leave that to him. I will say one thing, though, along these lines, and that is because we were converting from an industrial community, we had a lot of industrial spaces, industrial buildings, which, although they were no longer useful for industry as industry moved out, they became low-cost ways of housing innovative businesses. So as a developer or a property owner, you could acquire one of these industrial properties for very little, spend money on doing tenant improvements and fixing them up, and for relatively low rental rates, you could then turn around and attract businesses that were in those early stages of development, new businesses, innovative businesses that needed cheap space. So that's been a very important part of what we've been able to do with our transformation. And Rich has some great examples of how he and others were able to take advantage of that stock of properties. So one of the other things that Charlie touched on was that we spent, when we had redevelopment funds, we spent a considerable amount of money on building up our infrastructure. So we had a road system that was pretty minimal because it only had to serve trucks for industry. Didn't have to serve a lot of auto traffic from commercial and residential use. So we spent tens of millions of dollars on building the road network up. Not very glamorous, but key to providing the support necessary to attract new innovative businesses. Many years spent doing that. We also, we didn't just focus on the car, we also looked at our transportation system and looked at ways in which we could solve the circulation of new residents and office workers in non-automobile ways of travel. We don't, unfortunately, have a BART train station. We do have a train station on the main line that is a commuter line between San Jose and Sacramento called the Capital Corridors, which we took advantage of with the train station that Charlie mentioned. But we didn't have a connection to the BART system. So one of the innovative things that the city helped sponsor, but it was really a collection of property owners, Rich being one of the key ones, who had the idea of trying to make a stronger connection between our businesses and the closest BART station, which is about a quarter of a mile away. It's the MacArthur BART station. So what was happening was that we had these individual businesses and properties who had shuttles who were going back and forth. We had this collection of shuttles going to the BART station. And someone came up with a brilliant idea, let's combine all of those into one shuttle system. It's called the Emery Go-Round. We established that. It's a bus system. It's for free. It became a very important connection. You could connect to the BART station in about a 10 to 15 minute drive. Over time, as the community built up, it also actually became a local transportation system as well. And we ultimately created an assessment district that the property owners pay into that pay for the ongoing cost of maintaining that transportation system. So that was very key. Charlie also mentioned in the new general plan, there's a lot of emphasis now on bicycle and pedestrian circulation, and so much of the infrastructure improvements that have been done in more recent times have been oriented towards supporting those. We have an extensive number of people who travel within the city from work to residence on bikes, so we're very proud of our ability to support that. So those are key things: roads, transportation, location, having vision, political support. And then Charlie also mentioned one of the things that's somewhat, it's not unique, but I think it was somewhat predominant here in this community, and that was dealing with cleaning up toxic contamination. So many of these industrial sites that were converting to other uses had contamination. So there was a long period of time in this country where industry was unregulated as far as the disposal of the waste products that came from its manufacturing process. A lot of that was dumped into the soil, dumped into the waterways, and we then had to deal with that as new federal and state regulations came along and said you have to clean these up as your properties turn over into new uses. Well, that for the long period of time, that was a major deterrent to developers and property owners from converting their property. It was a huge cost to do that, and there was this large regulatory framework that was established that created a huge amount of uncertainty for property owners. Once they entered into that regulatory framework, they didn't know how much cost they were going to incur in cleaning up their property. And those two things became major inhibitions. So we said, we've got to tackle that because it affects so many of our properties. So we established what we called our brownfields program. We actually had one staff person who was totally devoted to it, Ignacio Dayrit, who did a wonderful job here for years and years. And he established these relationships with the regulators that he could take any property owner or developer who came in and give them assurances that he would help them through that regulatory process. He would give them some certainty that if they entered into that morass, he would get them out of it. And he did a great job doing it. And in fact, it was recognized nationwide by the National EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. We won several awards for our brownfields program because of the work that Ignacio was able to accomplish. And when we had tax increment funding, we went so far as to also help fund the cost of doing cleanup. So in some cases, we bought contaminated properties. The shopping center that you saw that had been the pigment plant, the redevelopment agency acquired that property. We spent $11 million on cleaning it up. We then resold it to a developer. We absorbed the cost of that cleanup. That was part of what we needed to do in order to overcome that problem. So what then can be gleaned from this that might be useful to you and to other cities? So obviously there's no more redevelopment around, but there is the idea of tax increment funding that still exists in California. There's a new piece of legislation, it's only just beginning to be used, called Enhanced Infrastructure Districts. And what it is, it's very similar to tax increment financing. It says you can establish a base here, and then you can take any new taxes, property taxes that come from new development, and you can allocate it to a separate fund that you can use for infrastructure improvements. So if you need to build roads or whatever, you can establish that district to do it. Now you have to get the consent of the other taxing entities who are involved, who may be affected by it. So there's some trade-offs there. They'll be looking for something in order to give up their future tax revenues. But it is a tool that cities can use by themselves if they choose to do that. If they want to allocate future tax revenues to a specific area for a specific cause, they can do that. One of the things that has also been very important, that will continue to be important for any community in our area, is fees and how much we charge for fees. So there are a lot of different fees that are charged in California for development. California has a very strong position economically. A lot of people want to be here, and governments have been able to charge a number of fees as a result of that. Childcare, affordable housing, transportation, the list goes on and on. But the more you add in the way of fee structure and burden to development, the more you're going to decrease innovative development and supporting innovative businesses. So keeping your fee structure low is very important to what we were able to accomplish. And for a long time, we had some of the lowest fees in the region, and purposely kept them that way in order to help support the new development. So then lastly, I want to, just as a way of segueing over to Rich, is to talk about public-private partnerships. So part of what we did as a mindset, as a community, was we said, we have this problem and we need this transformation, but we can't do it alone. We need to do it in concert and in partnership with the development community. And the development community at the beginning was 3 or 4 players who were willing to take on the risk, who had the vision to see what Emeryville could become, who was willing to overcome the problems with the toxic limitations that were imposed on various properties. And those were the pioneers, and those were the ones who we initially started to work with very closely. We provided some financial assistance, we provided that supportive zoning, we provided certainty as they went through the approval process so that they could get get their plans approved in an expeditious manner. And so we thought of ourselves as a community as a partner with the development community. And that's very critical in California, because there are many communities who are anti-development, who see developers as the enemy instead of the partners that will help them achieve their goals. So with that, I'd just like to finish by saying there have been many articles written, both positive and negative, about the transformation that occurred in this community. There's been quite a spotlight on Emeryville since it's in the middle of the Bay Area. One article had a quote from someone who said that Emeryville is just a developer who's masquerading as a municipality. And it was meant to be pejorative, but I actually considered it to be a compliment at the time. I think it was really indicative of our public-private partnership and our desire to try and assist the private sector with accomplishing innovation. So Rich, take it on.
Before you start, Rich, let me just get this off the screen, because it's a bit distracting. Okay.
May I start by saying I'm not very good at limiting my words, and never will be. Well, I have big appetite. I'm going to primarily respond to what's been said, as opposed to go into a lot of history, because I imagine what you want to know is going to come through a Q&A. But let me hit on a couple of very critical points. One issue that does not get magnified to the degree it should was the birth of the artist community because of the cheap rent in this area. I consider in our public-private partnerships, one of the key ingredients was the artist community in Emeryville. And the good fortune that they were here, and the creativity and the chi energy that was in the air. Because it allowed us to do a lot of things that couldn't have been done in a lot of other communities. The stability that both Charlie and Pat discussed was the overwhelming factor of what made a public-private partnership successful. Having John Flores and Pat O'Keefe as partners, having 3 critical council members, one who's still serving, Nora Davis, who wouldn't allow us to name the railroad station after her because she doesn't want to die yet, but that said, I was willing to bury her there, but on many an occasion. I think it was that is the critical ingredient, that you can't have too much political interference. The political process has to be a governor that has an alignment of interests, where there's a commonality, where we magnify the 60 to 80% we all agree on and accomplish those goals, and try to continue the dialogue of where we don't agree. The agreement to disagree is equally as important to the success of a community as any other factor. Because, as you know, because in your country right now you have polarized politics, in this country we're off the chart polarized. So there has to be both the concept that Ed always pronounced on the macro basis, as well as the incremental improvement on a micro basis. And those micro bases start with one of the more important issues that got overlooked in Emeryville for a while, and that's education. If you draw a circle where people want to be, it starts with the schools. If you have good schools, the businesses want to be there, your residential community will have incremental value, people will want to live there, and family housing is a key ingredient to people rooting in a community. Now, why did I start off on artists, public-private partnerships, and education? Because it's a convergence of forces. Yes, I mean, you're looking at one of the luckiest people on earth. I got to play social engineer in partnership and collaborate with some great people. All of what we do is a collaboration, and never lose sight of where the next gem's coming from. Because that gem may be in a regression analysis the critical factor that gives you the most interesting aspect that will change the cultural fabric in that community for the next 10 to 20 years. One of the things that happened, that ingredient, was life science. And I know you all want to know, because for 20 years people have been calling, how do you do it? Well, you start with Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford University. When you have those three universities at work, very similar to what you have in Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, you have already the platforms in place. When I came along, I took the wrong left turn. I was into restoration and rehabilitation, or as my oldest calls me, a burnt-out hippie, you know what. And that said, all of a sudden I was running across a lot of professors, and their whole augmented income came from working for pharmaceutical companies or research companies or doing research for larger corporations. Suddenly some of them got ideas, why am I taking this on an hourly basis when I can start my own company? And as Ed knows, I mean, I remember the days where I was, Cetus was one of my first tenants. And we had to put blue ink, red ink, yellow ink in canisters, so when they brought a bunch of people around to raise money, everyone said, oh my God, this is science. And you think that that didn't happen, but it was Hollywood all the way. And Cetus was the first large life science. In those days, we had no name, so we gave it a name, biotech. And it came from a PR guy who's still with us today, Tim Gallen, and we called it Biotech Alley. And Cetus raised $300 million, which back in the late 1970s, 1980s, was off the chart. Chiron leased space from Cetus, and that was a company started by two brilliant people. It was by Bill Rutter and Ed Penhote, two friends, and they started Chiron. Now, their thrust was more egalitarian because they were professors. Cetus had professors, but they also brought in what we call a Hollywood star in the scientific community to change their culture. Ultimately, we pushed and others pushed those two to join and merge. But what happened was Chiron was a first example of a very small company that leased a small amount of space, raised a little money, had an idea validated, that continued to grow, that merged into a multinational company purchased by Novartis. And from there, a lot of people in Chiron started 5 or 6 companies. So you say, okay, how did this all come to be? Well, the traction is in innovation, and what we used to call in the old days incubation. How do you incubate someone? Well, someone who's working in a large company has an idea, but it's not going to be big money for 5 or 10 years. They want to pursue that interest. You have to have smaller spaces. You have to have, excuse the expression, cheap space. Cheap space that also can give services that that individual can afford on its own and on their own. So about 11 years ago, and Ed and I shared this, and I'm not a big fan of the individual, but a governor we had named Gray Davis was persuaded to do something very bright called QB3. It was Quantitative Bionetics 3. 3 being University of California, Santa Cruz, University of California, San Francisco, University of California, Berkeley. And what that was what we were doing in the private sector called incubation. It was, how do you get a bunch of people for a couple $100 a month to validate an idea? They weren't even talking at the time about commercialization of research. They were talking about job creation. Because remember, it's politics, and political people always want to know, how do you create jobs and what's in it for me? Ultimately, it was good for the whole community, and there was an alignment of interests. Underline alignment of interests. Go back in history to Emeryville, and you have an alignment of interests, including quality of life. Now, quality of life gets shunted aside when development comes swooping through. But the great part about Emeryville was that even though they wanted to change and see their residential values change and increase, they had an idea that became a program that everybody bought into, as long as there was enough preservation of quality of life. Whether it was trees, and there was a planner in the old planning department who picked the absolute worst trees you could absolutely plant. But I think he got 2,000 free trees. So we had silver eucalyptus that we never should have been planted. You guys and your eucalyptus are killing us. We never got any lumber out of the deal either, just a lot of fire. But the idea was right. Change the concept. Back in 1978, because when I was 14, as I told you guys, I started Wareham. We're starting our 40th year. And what we did was we took an old building that had a lot of illegal uses, from research to epoxying tanks to illegal people living in spaces. And I went to the then director of redevelopment and planner at the time, because he did both. It was Mark Buell and Anderson at the time. And I said, we got to make this legal so I can get insurance. They said, we don't want these uses. We don't want to give social services. We don't want to pay for those type of uses. How can we do it? So they came up with a phrase to cover their butt called basically incidental residential. Now you say, well, what the hell does that have to do with life science? Well, those 1,200 square foot spaces, those 1,500 foot spaces, those 2,000 foot live-work spaces, not only brought artists, but it brought innovators, people who were working at home, people in the tech industry, because don't forget, Silicon Valley is south, but most of the knowledge, proprietary information, came from UC Berkeley, for most of Silicon Valley. And if you look outside the most recent years where Stanford would take over of who graduated there, most of the ideas in Silicon Valley came from UC Berkeley. And now UC Berkeley is into the nanotechnology. And I'll talk about nanotechnology, life science, energy in a moment. But where these little spaces came together was allowing people to live and work. That's an interesting concept. So you got the artists, now you got some live work. You're saying, okay, what the hell is he talking about? How does this tie together to commercialization? Well, Cetus and Chiron both were bigger companies. Chiron grew exponentially. Cetus was having trouble, but it had a lot of proprietary information. When they merged, the money from Cetus and the facilities from Cetus mixed with the egalitarian philosophy and hard-working knowledge of Chiron brought about certain serendipitous events. One of them was PCR. That came from Cetus and Chiron. Its applications is exponential across almost every sector in our life. You know it from crime and criminal, but it's also the basis of genomics. It's the basis of other areas of science. When that grew, other companies came out of that. In addition, there were other creative companies that came here besides research. Pixar was our company for 13 years in Point Richmond, which is a little further down the East Bay Shore. Steve Jobs came to me and said, I can't stay here anymore, even though I want to stay. And we have all their art, and we had all their original work that they did from Toy Story. He said, I can't recruit. I said, what do you mean? He said, for us to grow and recruit, besides our Pixar University where we teach people, we need to be closer to San Francisco so we can get people from Southern California, from the South Bay, from the North Bay. We're not centric right now in Point Richmond. Can you help me? I said, well, most developers don't like that type of thing because am I going to lose my tenant? But as it turned out, I'll tell you the story, it worked out well. He looked and really wanted Berkeley. But I'm going to go back to Berkeley and Berkeley's impact on Emeryville in a moment. Ultimately, Kaiser had this site locked up from Del Monte. And a competitor way back when, David Martin, had brought them there. But Kaiser couldn't get it together, and they saw some of the pitfalls and decided to centralize in one area of Oakland. And I heard about that. And we moved in with Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs obviously was a big figure, and the city loved him, and Pixar loved him. And the rest is history. I mean, it was an inverse takeover, Pixar really taking over Disney, if you want to know the truth. and Pixar continues to do great things today. But it was another creative element because the site was there, but the private-public partnership was equipped to take advantage of the opportunity. The impediments weren't laid there, but proactively they said, here's what we need to make this happen. And Pixar donated to the art, to the schools, to a lot of educational improvements, and Emeryville needed that help at the time. And they became a great community citizen, but the community, even with its concerns about growth, brought them in and made it easier to attract. You say, someone asked about incentives. Outside of redevelopment, there haven't been that many incentives. Recently, the cap got raised for business license fees. And a reasonable Solomon-like compromise was worked out for the larger companies. So there's an incentive there. But ultimately, the dialogue is the incentive. The ability to say, we really want this, we really need this. We really need this, we really want that. Because location does trump, but quality of life issues also is quite important. Because if you look what happened, Berkeley in the 80s started passing legislation about proprietary information. And what's going to scare stockholders and the capital markets more than anything is when a government agency says, I want to know what you're doing and how you do it. And so CEDAS came from Berkeley. We brought, Sybase came from Berkeley originally before they left. A lot of companies came from Berkeley. We're the largest developer in Berkeley, and I got very angry during those political times, said, you know, I've had it. And we went on a building spree here in Emeryville. It wasn't just for that reason, but it accelerated the volume and the type of companies we were bringing. And because the city wanted that proprietary information, a lot of science and a lot of technology that didn't go to the South Bay and could not grow in Berkeley came to Emeryville. And so you had that political juxtaposition that also was an incentive that allowed growth to come. Now, everything is balanced. The pendulum swings this way, pendulum swings that way. What you want to know is, well, how did we bring this about? As Pat mentioned, we didn't have a connection to BART. The earthquake came in 1989. We had a development ready to go on the Westinghouse site, which was where the Emory Station campus is largely there. We also owned the Chevron site, which had to be cleaned up. At the time, the city manager, John Flores, called me, can you come to my office? Sure. Came to his office. The head of Amtrak was there. We need a train station. How do we get a train station? We don't feel that Oakland's going to give us a train station. I said, oh, all right, we'll build it. He said, you will? When? I said, when do you need it by? And he said, in a year. I looked at Flores, and Flores looked at me. We said, okay. How long will it take for you to get your act together back at Union Station in Washington, D.C.? And it was about 6 months. So essentially, John went to the political powers and his staff to come up with a plan, and we figured out a private-public way to do it. We took the footprint of where the station was going to be and parts of the platform. John said, we'll do some tax incremental bonds on the infrastructure, because at the time we couldn't move fast. So we divvied it up. We didn't take redevelopment money, and we said, okay, I'll do this on a break-even basis. Because I said, if we build this station, then you got to be a partner with me to build what we're doing all around. And he honored his word, as did the council, as did Pat, who was a great deal of staff time went into this, and we did it. And it was the first train station built in California in 50 years. Now think about that. In 50 years, there wasn't any other train station built. That's nuts. But it was built. It was 10,000 feet. They had a big ceremony and whistles and everything. I just got word last year they passed 3 million passengers that went through that station last year. That doesn't seem like a lot in a big infrastructure, but it's essentially Transbay East that gets people to San Francisco. More importantly, it was tying into intra, which is our Emory go-round, which is taxis, now Uber and Lyft and people like that. But the idea was it was left off a major infrastructure. How do you compensate for that? Well, you're not going to compensate by saying we're better or we can do this. You're going to have to provide that service one way or another. And the creativity became, as Pat mentioned, the Emory go-round. How did the Emory go-round get founded? John Flores and I talked about it, and he gave me 2 tickets to what we call the Lincoln Box. That would mean going to a place where you're going to get shot. There was an old man named Lathrop who controlled 2 or 3 shuttles, and I had to go grovel and bark like a dog to get him to come together with us. And we put together 3 or 4 power people who could use this system and make it work. And we took on the cost in the operation. The city got a grant from, of all places, some Caltrans, some PG&E money. I don't know how that happened, but it was only about $350,000. But the more important issue was the city went and used creativity. Where can we get a bunch of grants, and will you match us in this endeavor? Will you align your interests so we can get this transit moving? Last figures, the Emory go-round does free of charge 7 days a week, averages somewhere around 8,500 to 9,000 passengers a day. It has GPS systems. We have dot racing. You can find at any moment in time where it's going to be, so busy people can be on their computer and know I have 5 minutes to the elevator down to the kiosk.
How's it funded?
How
do you fund that Emory go-round?
How did we found it?
How do you fund it?
Oh. You just, it's a site, an application, and in every lobby you have how many minutes till the shuttle arrives.
Funding.
A transit authority.
The P-bid, yeah.
We got to get a couple questions in.
So I'm rambling on, and I think time's of an issue.
Right, and we're going to do the tour of the companies over at Emory Station, and after that I understand we're going to reconvene in one of your conference rooms over there where we can continue with Q&A.
Whatever you'd like.
Is that okay?
I mean, I've rambled as I promised I would, but basically I'll end by saying something that's super important. We've been called by 30, 40 cities, how do you do it? And it's not us, it's a convergence of forces. And if there's 1 or 2 items to remember, it's public-private partnership and not just using the words, putting some weight into it, and an alignment of interests. And the third point would be magnify the 60% of commonality and deal with the agreement to disagree in a civil way.
Okay. Thank you. You want the mic? You're on TV, Ed.
Pat, are you coming with us for any of this? Okay. I'm sure Rich will answer all the questions, and he keeps mentioning I was around during this time. I wrote a book, it's still the largest seller in the world, called Planning Local Economic Development. And it was about putting together projects like this somewhat. But in those days, I think these guys thought I was crazy, because I thought you could redesign, redevelop, repurpose a city. So that's what I've been doing now for 50 years. And they were kind enough to go along with me, and things have worked out. But you do have to have some people from the university in the project. The Vice Chancellor of the university and I played tennis together. I was on what's called the Budget Committee of the University of California at Berkeley. There are 6 people on that committee. They have to be the most outstanding scientists at the university. I was the first African American ever to serve on that committee. So when I told guys in the biosciences, I have a project for you, they said, sure, Ed. But the scientists have to be in the room. They have no knowledge of business at all. But they understand people that understand them. So get them in the room if you're going to be successful. Don't bring them to a project. Bring them to a place. And that's what we did. They actually slept here, lived here. Their students did. One of them was here yesterday. So They have to be a big part of the project. Okay, let's get on the bus. Thank you, Pat.
See you.